subject matter material that I've ever taught about. And it's particularly emotional for me today because this presentation, there's a history behind it. And how I ended up here today giving this lecture is because I gave this exact presentation nearly, what was it, like 2 years ago or something like that. And it completely changed my life. For the worse and for the better, for both. And some of you guys know that because I gave this presentation, there were many things that followed up from that. One of it being, I was at Catholic University, and I'm going to talk about this. And one of the things that I get really frustrated at is people who know that I'm in school, everybody assumes that I'm doing theology. And people always say, so you're doing theology, right? No, I'm not doing theology. I took some theology classes, so don't act like I don't know what I'm talking about up here. But when I was going to school at Catholic University, I was doing something called Ethiopic studies. One of the hardest things for me to explain to people is to get them to understand that Ethiopic studies is a field, right? And just like any other field, like you think about engineering, doctors, lawyers, and that's the only thing I was trying to know. So, but just like it's a field, like people are like, I want to grow up to be an engineer. People actually are Ethiopic specialists. This is a field that people do. And if you haven't recognized, Ethiopic studies is a field dedicated to studying the history of Ethiopia. Are you guys with me? And what this field does is they study what the Ethiopian Orthodox saw, how the church was, what the history of the church was like, the history of the country was like, and they specialize in that, and it's a field that people specialize in. For 5 years of my life, I was in this program, in this field, studying the history of Ethiopia. And it was amazing until I started doing investigation. And I found out, as we will see today, that the majority of this field that's dedicated to studying the history of Ethiopia is sitting on the backs of fascist Italians who studied the history for the purpose of dividing our nation. Now, one of the things that really shocked me, and most of you guys may not know, is in Ethiopia right now, and I might have mentioned it, if you are an undergraduate in Ethiopia and you want to study history as a major, you can't do that. You guys hear me? There is no history department in Ethiopia right now. Imagine in a country where we're fighting about history, in a nation where there's civil wars happening because of our lack of understanding about history, unable to do so. There is something else instead of history that's offered, but I'm going to get to that in a second. So the point of this presentation that I did was to say, wait a minute, there's something wrong because all of the stuff that I keep reading, I noticed that the authors of these books and literatures that they were publishing were not Ethiopian, but they were... That was supposed to be a dramatic change. How do you do this? Why is down up? I'm going to press the down button, it goes up. Okay. So most of the names are Italians. Italian names. That's a red flag. I don't know if you guys know anything about Ethiopia, but Italians and Ethiopians, they weren't best of friends. Long story short, after I did this presentation that I'm going to go over today, A lot of things happened that led to me leaving the school, and now I'm at Howard University. And since the first time that I did this presentation, I delivered it to 3 other places. And my job, and if there's anything that I've done so far that I want to be remembered for, is for this presentation right here. This is the one thing that I think so far I've done that I think marks like the thing that I did. If people are going to remember me, I want to be remembered for this presentation. Because I put my heart into it. And I want people to understand why I'm so passionate about our history. What this presentation is, and I'm calling it a presentation today, not a lesson or whatever, because this is an actual presentation that I did 2 years ago, and I'm just going to do it again for you guys today. So this presentation covers rethinking the legacy of Ethiopian scholars. And now, when I talk about Carlo Conti-Rossini and Luco Cerulli, most of you guys are like, okay, who are these people? Why should I care about them? But if you go to anyone who studies history, especially Ethiopians, you'll recognize that these are household names. It's kind of like talking about, you can't talk about the history of basketball without saying Michael Jordan, right? You can't talk about soccer without saying Pele. You know? You can't talk about comedy without saying Trump. Sorry. But so the same way when you talk about history, and this includes, by the way, even like when you go to the priests, certain priests, and you talk about like the history of the church and things like that, they will mention these people as authoritative figures, not just on Ethiopian history, but Ethiopian church history. And right there should be red flags. Why? Why are Italians the scholars of Ethiopian history? Right there, you should have red flags going on. Alright? And the second thing that we're going to look at is, so we have to rethink about these guys. Who are they? What did they do? What contributions did? Why did they do it? We're going to look at that. But more importantly, the foundation of modern day Ethiopian studies, in part, is dependent on colonization ideals. Modern day historians are mainly dependent on colonialism ideas. And then we're going to look at how this study impacts Ethiopia and the Ethiopian church. We're going to look at that. So the first thing that I want to tell you guys is, like I said, this field known as Ethiopic studies is mainly studied by Westerners, mainly Italians, majority of them. But I'm not here to tell you that anybody who's white or a foreigner who studies history is racist. I wouldn't say that. There are a lot of Westerners who came to our land, who came to Ethiopia, who did positive things. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about today is all the people who did the negative things. All right? Now, like I said, I've given this presentation a couple of times now, and I had the hardest part making this point right here and getting people to be like, this is a big deal. Because when I give it, people are like, oh, okay, whatever. And the thing is, I'm like, there were people in the 1930s who studied Ethiopian history and they were racists. And people tell me, I don't know what happens, what can you do? I'm like, I don't think you heard me there. Because I'm not trying to tell you guys and be this passionate about people who lived in the 1930s who happen to be racists. There's nothing amazing about that. We know, not in the 30s, but even now, there are a lot of racist people who've existed. But there's a difference between saying there were racist historians or historians who happen to be racists and racists who are historians. Meaning, the primary driving force for early Ethiopian studies scholars was their racism. That is to say, the reason why they studied us
was because they were racist. Are you guys understanding what I'm saying? Let me give you a better analogy. Imagine if today we took the writing of white slave owners and their ideology about black people, and we studied their writing and used it to say, aha, this is what black people are. How messed up would that be? If we took the writing of slave owners who would say things like, black people are lazy, right? We take their writings, and in school we teach black students, you are lazy because the master said it 200 years ago. How crazy would that be? That'd be pretty crazy, right? I hope you guys. Well, this is exactly what's happening in Ethiopian studies, and I'm going to show you guys. The writings of colonizers about our history is being used to teach us who we are. If that doesn't scare you, I don't know what will. Again, the initiative to study the history of Ethiopia was based on a larger campaign to colonize Ethiopia. We're going to talk about this step by step. I just want to kind of set the tone here. Now, the reason why I have this image here is I want to be very clear and say, like, I take racism very seriously. It's not something like, I just like, oh, my teacher gave me a C, he's racist. Like, there's what I call careless, the notion of like, whatever, like, I'm not an angry black man. I'm angry. I happen to be black, but I'm not an angry black man, I promise. True story. When I was, I think like the first year at Catholic University, I had this professor who was lecturing about the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible and it being unique and different from all the other traditions. So after class, I went up to him and I said, hey, I'm Ethiopian. I happen to be like part of the country that you were lecturing about. And he says, oh my goodness, all my Uber drivers are Ethiopian. I was like, that's messed up. I got so mad because I was driving the Uber. And I was like, how did you know? Like, did I give you a ride? I was so upset. Now, in all seriousness, most of you guys are probably thinking, wow, he's so racist, whatever. And honestly, and I'm going to define it for you in a second, I don't call that racism. I don't think that's racism. A lot of people are like, whatever. I take racism, my bar for racism is high. This is ignorance. This is just not knowing. This is just like he wasn't thinking right. But in this discussion, when I'm saying that there were racists who wanted to study us, I mean that seriously. So what do I mean by racism? Webster's definition of racism is twofold. The first one is probably the one that most of us kind of associate with. Believe that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits. Wazata. So-and-so. That's what wazata means. So, this part of the definition, I think we all agree. And that's usually how we see it. Race is a fundamental determinant of a human trait. Meaning, okay, that guy, he stole because he's black. Oh, racism. Right? That's what we think of racism. But that's just one of the definitions. The second definition is a lot rarer, especially in our society. That is the systematic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. This is hard to prove. You guys agree? The systematic, it's not just having ideas about somebody, but you're doing something to oppress them. Number B, or part B, a political or social system founded on racism and designed to execute its principles. You guys with me? What I'm saying today is that people that we're going to examine not only were part one, but they also fulfilled the second part of racism. They didn't just have ideas about black people. They created a system to oppress black people, and that became known as Ethiopian studies, the script to teach us about our history. Are you guys with me? Yeah, I know, this sounds crazy. It sounds like I'm making it up, but that's why I'm this passionate about this. It's because the people who are studying our history are the same people who created a system based on racism and made sure that we had no part in it. First guy we're looking at is Enrico Cerulli. Who is, now most of you guys don't know who he is. Little profile. He was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ethiopia under the fascist regime between 1926 and 1931. Meaning, he lived in Ethiopia and he worked for the fascist regime as like an ambassador figure. 1935 is when the Italians, you guys know what happened in 1935? The Italians came to Ethiopia, right? We were never conquered, but they occupied. So, in 1935 they came, and then this guy, he left Ethiopia. He left Ethiopia, but in 1937, Mussolini, you guys know who this guy is, he promoted Cerulli to be the governor of the African Oriental Italian. This is like kind of a university level. So when he went to Italy, he became like a professor, a renowned professor. He was in Ethiopia, but that's not why I'm mad at him, it's because he knew Mussolini. If you guys know who Benito Mussolini is, right? He's like the Hitler of Italy. You guys gotta know your history. Right? He's like the Hitler of Italy. Like when we think about the worst people in the world, Hitler, Mussolini, and Trump. So, I'm gonna get in trouble. But that's not why I'm accusing him of racism. He lived in the 1930s. Enrico Cerulli was formally accused by the Ethiopian government as a war criminal. His convictions included complicity in systematic terrorism, mass killings, detention and torture of civilians, ethnic cleansing, denationalization, destruction of property, and use of chemical weapons, just to name a few. The list is long. And he appeared before the UN, and his name was officially added as a war criminal by society. He's known as a scholar of Ethiopian studies. He was involved in one of the biggest mass killings of Ethiopia. Over 4,000 people died when the Italians came. He was aware, he sanctioned it. And he's the scholar of Ethiopian studies. So when I say that he's racist, I'm not just like, he didn't like black people, he had negative views about black people. I'm saying he's like really racist. But he was involved in the killing of Ethiopians. Yes? We agree he's not a good guy? You guys agree? Let's keep going. The next is Carlo Conti Orsini. So we don't really have to kind of guess what he thought about us. We could read his own writings to see what he thought, his thinking about the Ethiopian people. This is another guy that's considered to be a scholar of Ethiopian studies. This is his own writings. He said, one may also study the native to learn to govern. I'll repeat that. One may also study the native to learn to govern. That means we should study these people so we can colonize them. Right? One may study him, the traditions of his past, and his customs and his customary law, even in those displays which at first glance can seem laughable. That's our traditions, those are our religions, those are our faiths, that's what we believe in. Like his beliefs and his practical superstitions, this is the faith, this is our religion, that he's saying is laughable. One must study with love. And one may keep quiet to know what is meant, what is seen, without worrying about the rest. And the embarrassment of having to still today, for the greater part of the Eritrean population, consult foreign works, the only ones frequently that may deal with them authoritatively, may seize at the end. This last part is perhaps the most scariest for me. This particular writing was done in Eritrea, but it also applies in Ethiopia. This section, worded, it's a little bit wordy, so it's hard to understand what it's saying, but he's saying, we have conducted research on the people so we can colonize them, but we shouldn't stop there. We should take away their history and give them our version of history. And we should ensure that they start to read the type of history we give them, and they're not dependent on their own. You see? So they should stop being embarrassed about the foreign sources. Foreign being them. They want to have ultimate authority on the history that they give us so that we can get rid of our own. Again, I say, is he racist? I think so. I think it's pretty racist. Pretty racist. Why should we care? Why do we care that they're racist? Well, I've talked about this manuscript before. Do you guys remember what this is? It says right here, Magdala collections. Do you guys know what the Magdala collections are? During the 19th century, when the British came to Ethiopia, they looted the country. And they took hundreds, if not thousands, of manuscripts. That's historical books from Ethiopia. And today, this is not something that's happened in history. Today, they sit in the museums, and they're rated at, thousands, if not millions of dollars. This is our holy books. That's been stolen from us. I was doing a research when I was in a program at Catholic, and there was this book called the Aksumite Collections. You guys may not know what it is, but you don't have it in Ethiopia. They have it. And the guy took a screenshot of the book. He sent it to me, and he said, "Don't share with other people." I'm like, you stole it from my grandpa. Like, what are you doing? Like, you don't share it with other people. You know what I mean? And it really, if you think about it, they steal the books, and then they tell us not to share with other people. This is serious, anyway, I'll get to that another time. But then the other reason why this matters is because you have to understand the history of Italy and Ethiopia to fully appreciate what is happening in schools around the world and why the West has decided to study Ethiopians. You've got to understand the history of Adwa. Now, what happened at the Battle of Adwa? What happened? Huh? Italians lost the war? Did the Italians lose the war? Did they lose the war? Like, horribly. They got beat pretty bad. It was horrible. It wasn't like, oh yeah, we won. It was like bad. It was so bad that in the newspapers in Europe, they started circulating how embarrassing it was for the Italians, the white people, to be losing, and I quote, to a bunch of niggers. These are things that they were saying. How could a nation like Italy, a white nation, lose to these black people? It was embarrassing. Newspapers like this were circulating around at the time. It says, the fact must be faced, although it is nowhere more sincerely deplored than in England, that events in Abyssinia constitute a great embarrassment for Italy. No matter what way they may be dealt with, Italy is most unfortunately involved in a difficulty which cannot be immediately shaken off by anything she can do. And to that extent, she is hampered in any other enterprise she may desire to pursue. How do you think the Italians are responding to this? Positively? Yeah. So for the next, 40 years or so, the Italians, they could not take it. We can't lose to black people. There's no way we're going to lose to black people. That's not happening. So in 1922, when Benito Mussolini got in power, the first thing he wanted to do was go back to Ethiopia for the second time to reclaim his status and to show the world, no, I can beat these bunch of niggers. This is what they were thinking. It's important you understand the history. It's important we understand how the world views us. It's important that we learn about our history. So, wanting to restore Italy's reputation, he took the first opportunity he had to go to war with Ethiopia. It was under this political climate, this ideology that the Italians had, that these two figures I mentioned earlier came to Ethiopia to study Ethiopians. See how it works? Their scholarship, their writings was being used for the fascist government to help them colonize the nation. Their study, their reports. Now, in order to understand how colonization worked, we have to talk about something called direct versus indirect rule. This is how colonization worked. So, you guys know about colonization, yes? Yes? How did colonization begin? Somebody. Why did it begin? Why did it begin? What? Exactly, because of the Industrial Revolution, the West became like really greedy, right? So all of a sudden, they were able to produce things quickly. They were machines, that's what the Industrial Revolution, very quick. And they became hungry for stuff. They wanted more things. We want things. Where can we get it? Oh, Africa is the place to go. One of the things that the Industrial Revolution did is it created a lot of guns, a lot of like weaponry, right? So they were able to go there and just take things from people. So of course they did the Great Berlin Compromise, whatever it's called, and all the Western countries, they started dividing out Africa. You get that part, you get this part, I get this part, you get that part, and they divided it out. And there was the first system that Westerners used on Africa, something called direct order. So direct rule or direct order is when the West comes to Africa and they say, we're here to rule. And they rule, they live and direct everything in that country. The problem is, the ruling party's up here and the rest are down here. And because they're there to take their money and to get rich, the ruling party gets richer and richer and richer. And the poorer, what happens? Yeah, poorer. The ruling party, in terms of numbers, they're less than the people they're oppressing. The people on the bottom, they're more of them. So eventually, the people on the bottom, they're gonna look up and say, wait a minute, I'm getting poor, you're getting rich. I don't like that. That is not working for me. So that's how we have something called coups, where they take over the leadership, they fight and they win because they have the number. You see how it works? You see how it works? So the West started saying, this is not a good method. We can't rule this way. So instead, let's do it through indirect order. Indirect rule. So what they did is, they select a group of people within the country to rule. They give them some money, they give them some sources, they give them something, and there's a group of people within the country ruling over them. And the back is the West, but the people on top, they're Africans. And they rule over the other people. And now the disparity happens. And the people, they want to overtake the people. Who do they see right above them? Other Africans. And then the people start fighting, Africans against Africans. All in all, the West is reaping the benefits. They take the money. Nothing happens to them. Are you guys with me? Is everybody guys with me? Yes? So the question becomes, how do you select the people on top? How does the West determine who to put on position of leadership. An indirect rule, there were 3 areas that was used to select the people to rule. That was religion, language, and ethnicity. So you divide the people according to language, you divide the people according to ethnicity, you divide the people according to religion, and you say, this ethnic group is smarter than that ethnic group. This ethnic group should rule. And when that group starts ruling, you begin your indirect rule. Let's look at examples of this. The first one, as I said, is religion segregation. What they wanted to do is they wanted to separate the religion. Muslims this way, Christians this way, and so on and so forth. And they were very clear, by the way. If you guys read the notes, it's pretty shocking. Literally, from this mountain to this mountain, Muslims only live here. And then from this area to this area, Christians live here. So what happens when you segregate people and they're no longer talking? They begin to see each other as enemies. You see how that works? If you go to our parents' generation and you talk to them about Christians, Muslims, they love one another. Like our grandparents' generation, they're like, well, yeah, Muslim. Is there a difference? That's what they would say. As a person in the church, yes, there's a difference and all that stuff. But when you think about it as a nation, it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing for people to come together and like during fasting season, during Ramadan, Christians would go and congratulate the Muslims. During Psalm season, they'd be like, oh, you're not fasting for this, here's this. It was love. But the more you divide people, you segregate them, hey, these people are your enemy, they believe it. You can't do that kind of stuff anymore. An example of how this was implanted into the society is the Penal Code for Colonial Eritrea and the 3rd book, Title 1, Chapter 1, Article 483, that talks about religion tolerance. So the whole idea of religion tolerance is we have to respect other religions, so we can't do anything. And then this Penal Code says, anyone who, against the legal prohibition of competent authority, promotes or directs religious ceremonies outside places intended of worship, that will get punished. So what it's saying is, if you're in a church, you're only allowed to worship in the church. Don't you come outside, because religion tolerance. What they're saying is, we don't want you guys to talk to one another. Especially when it came to religion, the Italians, they knew that part of the reason why they lost the war in Adwa, in the battle in Adwa, is because Ethiopians were able to come together under religion, Orthodox. They knew that. And he said, whenever people come together, that's a bad thing for us. We can't rule them as effectively as possible. So the first thing we have to do is break down this religion that's there, that's uniting them. Second thing they did, they separated the people according to language. Girard talks about this in his article. He says, alongside Italian as the main medium of instruction in the lingua franca from Amharic, Tigrinya, was introduced for Christians and Arabic for Muslim students. This is saying, basically, if you guys think about it, we are in the DMV area. And imagine in Virginia, there's a new law that says, from now on, all people in Virginia, they can only learn German. And everybody in Maryland, they can only speak in French. Right? This is, imagine, before computers, before anything. That means Virginia and Maryland, you could probably, get there within, 30 minutes or so? But over a generation, 2 generations, even though they're 30 minutes apart, they can't communicate to one another. They start forming their own ideas, their own philosophies, their own cultures, their own circles. And then they become the other people. The Marylanders, those French-speaking people, oui and all that, nine, so it's gonna be like, it's a different atmosphere, even though these people were the same, and the thing they did the most effectively, unfortunately, is able to merge the language with the religion. Today, if you speak Amharic, you're considered an Orthodox. This is true. Yes? If you speak Tigrinya, you're considered Orthodox. If you speak Oromia, you're likely Muslim. This is an ideology that's been implanted into the people. People really believe this stuff. They really see these things to be true. Maybe not you guys because you're young, but if you look at your parents' generation, they absolutely believe it. They don't just think they believe it's true. These ideas were planted into the society when the Italians got here. The last is, of course, ethnic division. In order to make sure that people are segregated so that they could be ruled effectively, you have to divide the people by ethnicity. Our friend Carlo Rossini, one of the guys I mentioned earlier, this is part of the publications he posts about the ethnic group. In reality, the Tigrinya Dominion marks an epic of profound decadence in every respect of Eritrea. Worse happens with the takeover of and there were other ethnic groups, I didn't know who they were, at the time of the UPA. Not only is the country ruined by invasions, taxation, and foreign oppression, but the exasperation of conflicts and hatred between the Akle, Guzai, Sarai, thanks also to the politics of the Amhara and the very bloody jealousies between the houses of other ethnic groups. So they're creating scripts of who is on top, who should be hated, who should be divided, and who gets the blame. These are things I'm reading to you not based on current politics and stuff going on. Right? These are things written in the 1930s by Italians, by fascists, whose purpose was to divide the country. So, at this part of the presentation, people are still looking at me like, come on, man. That was like, what, 70 years ago, 80, 90 years ago? Like, why do I care? Right? That was in the past. There's some dead Italians wrote all this stuff. Why should that affect me? Right? The question is, do people still think this way? Do people really believe these things today? Well, let's look at it. I wasn't changing all of you guys. I'm changing here, I'm thinking it's changing there. You guys are just looking at me. Okay. This is an actual book that I was given when I was at Catholic University. Part of my program was to read this volume, which was published in year 2020 during COVID. It's called A Companion to Medieval Ethiopian Eritrea. And there are 16 essays. This volume was published by the leading scholars of Ethiopian history, considered the best of the best in the world. There are 16 essays in here about Ethiopia. 15 of the 16 essays refer to the two Italian guys that I just mentioned as authority in Ethiopian history. The two guys that I mentioned, one a war criminal, the other guy explicitly telling us that his goal to study Ethiopia was to conquer them, are among those accredited for the flowering of Ethiopian studies in the contemporary sense. The guy that I said was a war criminal is described as being an outstanding scholar by Westerners today. This is not in the 19th, by today. He's called an outstanding scholar, a war criminal. To us, a scholar to the West. Rossini, the guy who said he wants to study us, to colonize us, is said to be the most prominent Ethiopianist of the 20th century. The most prominent of Ethiopian history. It's not Ethiopians who have authority on Ethiopian history. It's Italians. I ask you, is that a problem? Is that a problem? I think it's a big problem. Let's keep going. My previous presentation, it didn't look like this. I had somebody's face up here, and he's the biggest, kind of like the head of the Ethiopian history department, and he says that the guy who said he wanted to colonize us is one of the greatest figures in Ethiopian studies. The war criminal guy, he says, is one of its greatest and most prominent Orientalists. Orientalist just means like, it's in the studies of Ethiopic studies. But the part that really got me upset is after saying this, like this guy, like these great scholars, he says, hey, don't blame me. There are Ethiopian scholars like Yaakov Bayen and Taddese Tamirat who also think that these guys are great. So it's not me as a white man saying this, but these Ethiopian guys feel the same way too. So why are you blaming me? Does that make sense? Yeah, and there's some truth into that. Sadly, there's a lot of Ethiopians, historians, priests, church fathers, who refer to these people as authoritative figures in Ethiopian church history. It's not Ethiopia, it's not our forefathers that they're quoting. They're quoting Italians to give you an idea of what church history looks like. I ask you, is that a problem? I think so. But the reality, why I got upset, again, this is one of the leading figures in Ethiopian studies today, is because one of the guys he mentions, Taddese Tamirat, is an Ethiopian. And what he actually said is that there seems to be no doubt that Chiruli's consummate scholarship on Ethiopia and Somalia lent itself so handsomely to the formulation of high-level colonial policies in Rome. So even the Ethiopians were warning us, these guys, they're up to no good. Why are we listening to them? Why are we following their history? So the debate now among many people is like, okay, they were racist. Let's admit that. They were colonizers. Let's admit that. But they were really smart. And, they wrote a lot of history books. Why can't we read their history books? This is real questions that people are asking. These are questions that Ethiopians are asking. These are questions that scholars are asking. This is questions many people ask. Despite the fact that they wanted the colonizers, why can't we just read their books? What's wrong with it? Should we listen to R. Kelly's music? Should we? Okay, anybody yes? Anybody yes? There's some people that are scared. They're like, I don't want to raise my hand. Alright? The thing is, people debate about this all the time, right? I'm not going to listen to it. I think the guy was just too off. But people debate both ways. One of the things that we can all agree on is if R. Kelly made a music about raping young girls, we should have listened to that music at least. At least let's agree there, right? Like you can try to, but he's the greatest musician, whatever. But if he creates music about raping young girls, at least then you'd say, I'm not going to listen to the music. Yes? These guys are producing work that's talking about racism. These guys are producing work with the intention of dividing the people. If you're going to study as a code for saying, look what the Italians did in the past. Not as authoritative history on Ethiopia. Are you guys following me? Are you guys following me? I feel like sometimes I'm talking to myself. But more importantly, Conte Rossini explicitly mentions his desire to study the history for the purpose of colonizing them. That is, he's saying, don't separate my history and my studies from my attempt to colonize these people. In order to properly honor these Italians, we have to call him a colonizer, because that's what he wanted. He's saying, call me a colonizer. Don't call me a historian. So I believe him. I think he's a colonizer. But that's not the only reason why I object to their work. Because they were racist in their scholarship, they had biases that make them have the wrong conclusion. Very dangerous conclusions at times. Let's look at some examples. Cerulli published a work on this ruined church, kind of like, material that was left over, called Martula Maria. And this debris, or the church that he found, he noticed that the ornaments and the designs, they were carefully made. A little too good for the black people to do on their own. And he concluded, because the ornaments and the designs are so advanced, that black people couldn't do it on their own. This is an actual scholarship that he published that people started believing. There's several things wrong with this analysis. Number one, he never actually went to study these artifacts that existed in Colonial. He never looked at them. What he did is, he read a report by what another Westerner wrote, and he made this conclusion. But because he's the authority in Ethiopian history, people started believing him. Later on, when further investigation was done, this unusual mastery, that's what he called it, unusual mastery for the black people, was actually done by Ethiopians. And there's no evidence that other people came and helped us out. You see, we are capable of doing unusual mastery. We are capable of that. That's the first one. The second, how am I doing on time? Am I doing on time? Good? Good. Senegal winning? Sorry. Focus. So the second guy, he was biased, and again, I've read this several times. This is part of the articles that they published. This actual publication was part of my PhD reading class. This actual one. And this is given. Now, me, I'm in Ethiopia, I know my history. But Westerners read this, and they think this is actual scholarship. They think this is research. And it reads, and I believe, such belief is found even among the most cultivated Abyssinians, who have frequent contacts with the West. The strong faith of Abyssinians has swallowed the most doubtful pseudo-epigraphic books as authentic, and they do not entertain any doubts at all about the most blatant magical texts. In his barbaric and uncritical, superstitious spirit, the Abyssinian will believe everything. I ask you, is this scholarship? Is this research? Is this what we do? Is this our belief? Does this describe us? And yet, these are the type of articles published in our name, using our religion, our faith. This is being published. Now, what I'm talking about today is not something that I'm just making up on my own. It's not something that I've said and I'm the first person to say. There were others like Edward Said, a very well-known and appreciated scholar, who's kind of let the people know and signal, hey guys, there's something wrong in this field. And again, as I said, Orientalism is the study of the East. It's not just Ethiopia, but it incorporates Syria and what we call the Levant area, the Middle East, including Ethiopia. And this Edward Said guy, he says, once we begin to think of Orientalism, that is the study, including Ethiopian studies, as a kind of Western projection onto and will to govern over the Orient, this is us, we will encounter fewer surprises. He goes on to say, it raises questions about the predisposition towards innocence or guilt, scholarly disinterest or pressure group complicity that keeps going on. So, again, how does this affect scholarship? And how did it affect present-day historians? Both of Cerulli's and Conti Rossini's work involved around highlighting the difference that existed among Ethiopians. Both of Cerulli's and Rossini's work involved around highlighting the differences that existed among Ethiopians. So, this is what happens. Do you guys remember direct versus indirect rule? Their goal is to fracture the country. So the scholars focus on the ethnic group of this person. If you guys read, there are many books that talk about this ethnic group, they have long noses. This ethnic group, they their face is weird and their eyes is this, and then they separated everybody. The Oromos did this, the Amaras they did, the Tigres did this. Over a generation, you have people that only know the history in terms of ethnicity. Because that's the only thing being published. And people forget, hey, wait a minute, there used to be a time we were one. There was a time that we were all together. Because the only thing being produced is how to divide the country. And this is the part that people are missing, today's generation. They forget that. Remember, part of the goal is to take away our version of the history so that we can just accept theirs. That was a goal of colonization. When it comes to Rossini, because again, we're doing indirect rule, they have to pick someone to say you are the best fit to rule. They begin to organize the society in a hierarchy and structure, saying the South, those who assimilated with the South Arabians are on top of the list. Do you guys remember the theory of the South Arabians? We talked about this in the beginning of the series. You guys remember? So what was the first empire we talked about? What empire did we start with? You guys remember? Anyone? Aksumite Empire. You guys remember? We said the Aksum Empire was huge. For those of you guys who don't know, the Aksum Empire was compared with Rome and Persia. And we were considered to be one of the greatest empires that ever lived. Right? But the Italians, when they came, they started studying it. They were like, black people can't do this. The only explanation for this great empire is the Arabs must have come and helped these black people create this empire. You guys see how it works? You guys see how it works? It was only the Arabs. The Arabs are great. The Arabs, they're amazing. Black people can't do this. It was the Arabs. So, the Italians in the 1930s say, whoever assimilated, that's happy time and have kids, with the Arabs, are on top of the list. Those in the southern region, because the Arabs came through the north, who did not assimilate with the Arabs, are barbaric. You know what's sad? The northern region, this is your so-called Tigres and Amaras and all this. You know what's sad? I've heard people on TV saying, we're from the South Arabians. We're the better ethnic tribe. And they cite these Italians. And they believe this is garbage. If you think your ethnic group is better because you came from Arabs, you're taking the script from Italians. If you think your ethnic group is superior to another ethnic group, you're following the script of Mussolini and his followers. This is the thing that we don't understand. You're following history that the Italians wanted you to believe. Let's keep going. Now, you guys don't know these people, but these are kind of like the founding fathers of Ethiopic studies, the best of the best. And these guys influenced this guy called Edward Undorf. I talk about him a lot in my book. This guy, he literally starts to talk about people's faces and their mouth and their eyes. This ethnic group, he's this tall. This ethnic group, they're this way. And he really divides the people. And then their work is finally here in the volume that I talked about. And what does this volume have to say on the relationship of Ethiopian Christians and Muslims? It says, this is a direct quote from a journal published in year 2020. Christians have tended to consider Muslims as eternal refugees to whom the Ethiopian state mercifully can grant protection and safety, but without recognizing them as real fellow countrymen. In essence, it's saying Christians don't accept Muslims as Ethiopians. I don't know how much you're following Ethiopian politics right now, but there's a huge civil war brewing between the Christians and Muslims. And the number one question that Muslims are saying is, why do Christians not accept us as Ethiopians? That is the question they're asking. If you go to, who can answer this question? They go to the universities, Ethiopian scholars. Who do you think the Ethiopian scholars are reading? These guys. Who do you think they're going to reference? These people. You get an 18, 19-year-old young Muslim man, and he wants to study his history. And he comes across this authoritative document on his history, telling him we don't accept him as a fellow countryman. What do you think he's going to think? This is how civil war is created. This is a major issue happening today. This is not 1930s, this is 2020. This is a new volume published just 2 years ago that people are going to continue to read. But it doesn't stop there. It continues. As you know, one of the most controversial figures of history is Menelik II, Emperor Menelik II. If you guys have been following, he's either a hero who rescued the Ethiopians during the Battle of Adwa, or he's a villain that went across cutting the breasts of Oromo women. And these conversations are the result of the civil war that's happening today. So I ask you, is he a hero or a villain? My answer? Let's sit down and discuss. Let's sit down and discuss. Let's talk. Let's have conversations. Let's review our history books. But the point remains that this question should be answered by Ethiopians. It's not for the West to tell us whether Menelik is a villain or a hero. It's up to us to say we agree that he's a hero or he's a villain or somewhere in the middle. It's up to us to direct our history. But on this volume, they said the following: the small number of studies dedicated to this subject before the 1990s can be explained by 3 factors. Number 1, the relative scarcity of the documentation, I'll come back to this, the production of historical accounts that privilege the continuity, and the marginalization and subjection of Oromo people after the often violent conquest led by King Menelik II into Oromo territory at the end of the 19th century. Here's the issue, is number 1, there's no footnotes. If they're going to take such a drastic position on such a sensitive topic, I would expect to see some footnotes to say, based on these evidence that we have found. The second thing they told you, there's relative scarcity. We don't know, we don't have enough readings. And yet they took a position on this issue. Again, I ask you, what is a young Oromo person to say if they went and read this about their history? What is anyone going to say when they read this history? Now, I'm not here defending Menelik. I'm not here defending history. Don't get it confused. I'm not here on anybody's side. I'm saying this is for us to determine. I don't want to be told about my history. I'll tell you my history. I'll tell you who I am. Don't tell me who I am. That's for me to judge. That's for us to discuss. That's for us to debate. As I wrote in my book, if we're going to go to civil war, we're going to fight, so let it be. But it should be because we decide. It shouldn't be because we're like puppets. People from 1930s, the dead scholars, who implanted this in our country based on their interpretation that we are fighting one another. That shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen. We should have a say in our history. The reason why I made this presentation is so at least one person can hear this and say, I want to know more about my history. I told you in the beginning, there is no history department in Ethiopia. Well, after 2 people that I told you, Enrico Chiruli, once he went to Italy, he started his own program of Ethiopian studies. He taught a man by the name of Pablo Marasino. In 1994, his student came to Ethiopia, and he started what's known as a philology department. That's code for history. It's the same. in Ethiopia, the best of the best, those of you guys who know Member Rodas, for example, the guy with the stars and stuff like that, he went to school at the philology department that the Italians instituted. The people that are going to Ethiopia and getting their PhDs on the history and becoming known throughout the country are reading the scripts written by the Italians. I'm not saying these are bad people for doing it. I'm saying we're still following the script that they've given us. It's time we take control of our own history. It's time that we say, let me learn more about who I am, about my church. Not what other people are telling me, but what I want to learn about. It's up to you, the new generation. It's up to you to say, I'm not going to accept what the politics is saying. I'm not going to accept what my parents are saying. I'm going to study history for myself because it is who I am. And then spread it to others. That's all I got.